at, and so there's not fantastic. Thanks. A recording meeting. There's not a lot of changes, if any, that the state of Vermont can make in the specificity of the rule. However, there's a conversation to have that we want to have today about what it means for Vermont to go down this path and what needs to be real for Vermont so that this rule, if adopted, feels like a benefit and not like a burden for Vermonters of all types. So that's the discussion we want to have later today. Let me say a word about Zoom and what we're doing and how we're doing this today. If we can go to the next slide. So we are recording the meeting, and just a heads up, we're doing that. And the slides and the recording will be made available after the meeting at that link, which isn't that helpful because you can't click through right here, but maybe we can drop that in the chat too. That could be a good thing to do if someone from the A&R team could drop that link in the chat. We're going to ask folks to hold questions until we're done with the block of presentation. And then we're really going to have time for some conversation, discussion around them. And this is, we're all here together in one happy Zoom room. This is not a webinar per se. This is, we're all here. So we're going to need your help during the presentations and during the Q&A. If you're not speaking, to stay on mute, all that good stuff. We welcome you to have your camera on. If in your place, you could do that. And if you haven't been a Zoom person in these last 2 years, I'll make sure we reiterate how you raise your hand in Zoom later. Let's go back one slide. Yeah, there we go. So to start off, we're going to ask you in general not to use the chat, but I do actually want you to use the chat right now. And what I'd like for you to do in the chat, if we could go forward, if we could go forward to the next slide. I'm just curious. Now, we're a lot of people. We're 68 people in this Zoom room right now, but I'm interested of the first thing that comes to mind that is obviously respectful and appropriate to share in the chat. The first thing that comes to mind when you hear the word electric vehicle or EV, what comes to mind? There we go. I see people doing it. Fun, less pollution. All right. You guys can watch the chat as I am, right? Charging, right? The future. All right. Batteries, managing charging. Where do I charge up? Yeah, great. Still dangerous, right? Expensive, right? Okay, great. So we walk into this conversation with a whole bunch of thoughts. And when we've done this in the public meetings as well, in person, we also get comments in addition to sort of expensive, we've got, still dirty in the, battery production, things that are on people's minds of how clean really are they, right? And so those are the kinds of things we want to make sure we continue to think about as we listen to the presentation and we get into the conversation after the presentation. Great. That's great. Thanks everybody for jumping in. Now I will ask you to refrain from the chat as we go into the presentation. Hold your questions until we get into the discussion piece so we don't get a parallel conversation going on in the chat while we have the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Deirdre Ritzer, who is a manager at A&R and is closely involved in the rulemaking process and is going to walk us through a presentation that talks about the context of this rule, some of the details of the rule, and then some of the details about what exists today in helping Vermont make this transition. So Deirdre, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, David. So before we dive into what the rules will require, I'd like to start with what we need, why we need to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and air pollution that come from motor vehicles. For many years, we've seen the impacts of climate change, which is caused by greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont. We're seeing warmer summers and winters, earlier arrival of spring and later arrival of winter, and increased precipitation and flooding events. We also know that not everyone is impacted equally by climate change. These effects are felt more severely by frontline and low-income communities. Of course, climate change is a global issue, and as a participant in the global economy, we need to participate in our achieving of our share of emissions reductions and take climate change seriously in response to these impacts. These rules are part of our strategy to act to mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases and work cooperatively and in coordination with our state and federal partners. Next slide. So how do we reduce emissions? Focusing on greenhouse gas emission reductions in the transportation sector makes sense, as the majority of our emissions, about 40%, come from cars, trucks, equipment, and other mobile sources of emissions. These rules we are proposing today are estimated to result in significant reductions to our emissions from the transportation sector and are therefore a critical component of meeting our emissions reduction goals. These rules are also incorporated into Vermont's Climate Action Plan, which was adopted by the Vermont Climate Council at the end of last year. While the plan acknowledges that these rules need to be implemented along with a strategic and equitable set of complementary policies, the regulatory framework that we'll discuss today is the catalyst to shift our transportation policy in an effective way. Next slide. A strong focus of these rules is also related to reducing traditional air pollutants that cause serious public health challenges in Vermont. There are a few associated pollutants and their health impacts on this slide. Volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxides, VOCs and NOx, combine to form ground level ozone, also known as smog. This triggers asthma attacks and damages lung tissue. Fine particulate matter causes respiratory and cardiovascular damage. Breathing air with elevated concentrations of ozone is especially harmful to children and the elderly, and people of all ages who have asthma and other respiratory impairments. Many Vermonters are disproportionately impacted by air pollution from heavy truck traffic and idling. We also know that disadvantaged communities and frontline workers tend to experience a disproportionate share of the negative health impacts. Next slide, please. So Vermont has been working to reduce motor vehicle emissions for 26 years. The proposed rules today are not a new program, but one that's been in place and administered for decades. We have been a leader in reducing motor vehicle emissions, being the first non-California state to adopt standards for greenhouse gas emissions in the early 2000s. We've also required automakers to deliver EVs to Vermont for over 20 years. And today's change to that requirement reflects a continued partnership with automakers, and it reflects their commitments to this technological shift. In addition, Governor Scott signed on to the medium and heavy duty multi-state memorandum of understanding to make commitments with regional partners. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we're not alone in implementing this program. We are currently partnered with 17 other states across the country to reduce emissions, making our efforts as a small state exponentially more impactful. The states shaded on this map have adopted one or more California motor vehicle emission standards, and these states combined with California make up approximately 36 to 40% of the US new light duty vehicle sales. The proposal we'll cover today represents the next steps in a long-standing program that has been successful in driving critical technology changes and reducing not only greenhouse gas emissions, but emissions of other harmful air pollutants. Next slide. Next, we'll focus on some details of what Vermont is proposing today. This rulemaking mainly consists of updates to the current low and zero emission vehicle rules, The proposed rule makes emission standards and electric vehicle sales requirements more stringent over time. But these are all requirements that automakers have to meet, not consumers. The rules do not require anyone to buy an EV, and used internal combustion engine vehicles, gas and diesel powered vehicles, will still be sold and driven once the 100% EV sales requirement for new passenger cars and light duty trucks comes into effect for automakers in 2035. The rules also require automakers to make cleaner versions of gas and diesel powered cars and trucks, and that the vehicles they make be more durable and come with longer warranties. Next slide. Automakers will need to meet a series of milestones as we transition to a more electric fleet. For passenger cars and light duty trucks, automakers will be required to continue delivering a certain percentage of electric vehicles to Vermont. And these percentages will increase to 100% in 2035 or in 13 years' time. The chart shows the percentage of new vehicles delivered to Vermont that are required to be zero emission vehicles. The small green line in the bottom left represents the minimum percentage of new electric vehicles required in the current regulation adopted many years ago. The purple line just slightly above that represents projected EV sales in Vermont, and jumping up to the dark blue line represents the proposed percentage of new zero emission vehicles delivered to Vermont. And automakers will be able to comply in several ways, including using banked compliance credits and generating credits by complying early or investing in programs that make EVs more affordable. Next slide, please. For heavier trucks, automakers will need to start delivering a set percentage of electric vehicles to Vermont, but on a less aggressive timeline than what we're seeing for the passenger cars and light duty trucks. This piece is a new rule. The stringency of this rule is different for good reason. The electric vehicle technology for heavier vehicles is slightly behind that of passenger cars. So this program will not phase out fossil fuel trucks. And on this slide, the top bar in green represents medium duty vehicles, class 2B through 3, which are typically heavier pickups, vans, and delivery vehicles. And you see the percentage of vehicles that need to be zero emission by 2035 is 55%. And looking at the blue bar, that's class 4 through 8 vehicles, box trucks, bucket trucks, dump trucks, buses, and that gets up to 75% of new vehicle sales by 2035 need to be zero emission. And then last is the purple bar, which is class 7 and 8 truck tractors, which has a 40% of new vehicle sales need to be zero emission by 2035. Under the proposed framework, there will still be available for sale after 2035. Fossil fuel trucks will still be available for sale. Next slide, please. To accompany the transition to EVs, automakers will be required to make the internal combustion engine that they will continue to sell even cleaner. We already require that automakers meet certain emission standards for air pollutants from passenger cars and light duty trucks. And the new requirements for medium and heavy duty trucks will build off that existing program. So here we're talking about reductions in pollutants that we discussed earlier, nitrogen oxides, volatile organic compounds, particulate matter, which impact public health and the environment. Next slide, please. So now that we've talked about what automakers will be required to do under the proposed rules, let's talk about how Vermonters, both individuals and business owners, might be impacted by the rules. On the screen, you'll see a series of questions that we've already been receiving from Vermonters who have questions about EVs and how they are a part of Vermont's vehicle fleet, both now and in the future. Next, we'll share some information that will help to answer these questions and support Vermonters in this transition. Next slide, please. First, it's important to acknowledge that the future of EVs will look different from today. This change will phase in, not tomorrow, but over a period of 13 years. We consider these rules a codification of the commitments that automakers have already made, and we're working cooperatively with them to ensure that the goals of the program are met. Also, this kind of technology shift is not unprecedented. Think of what your cell phone looked like 13 years ago and how the cellular network has advanced to support these changes in devices that can practically do anything. We do estimate that by 2025, 180 models of EVs will be available. By adopting these rules, we can create more choices for Vermonters. The increase in availability means that the current reality of EVs costs versus internal combustion engine vehicle costs will change in the future. As automakers deliver more EVs to Vermont, there will be more vehicles to meet the demand. Also, the cost of EV components, including batteries, continues to go down. With more EVs coming to Vermont, the used EV market will also grow, making used options more affordable and available. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, these rules represent a cooperative relationship between the state and the automakers. And here's just a snapshot of the landscape of the commitments automakers have made and how the rules reflect these commitments. Next slide. So we've checked in on what the future of EVs might look like and anticipated impacts to the vehicle market and the cost of EVs. Now we'll focus on the current realities of buying and owning an EV in Vermont. First, we'll focus on a major barrier, the higher upfront cost of an EV. There are currently several programs available to help combat this barrier of a higher upfront cost. The state of Vermont currently offers a new plug-in electric vehicle purchase incentives with up to $4,000 available. And the incentives are tiered based on your income level. So the lower the income level, the bigger the incentive. And that's for lower to moderate income Vermonters. The federal government offers up to a $7,500 tax credit for some EV models. In addition, there are incentives offered through your electric utility. There are new programs coming out, including Replace Your Ride, which recently started, I believe, a couple of weeks ago. And they offer up to $3,000 for a purchase incentive. And Mileage Smart is a program run by Capstone. And they offer up to 25% off used, highly efficient vehicles, including plug-in hybrids. And then we recently had an electric bike incentive program, but I believe that was quite popular and that money has been drawn down. So hopefully that'll be something that we can look forward to again in the future. And I want to mention that there are several state agencies on the computer today at this meeting. I expect Dave Roberts at Drive Electric Vermont will be on this call, and he is a wealth of information, can help provide really any information about EVs in general, especially incentives and how they might be stacked. There are typically VTrans is in the meeting today, and I know that they can speak to the incentive programs as well as Replace Your Ride and Mileage Smart and the electric bike program. And I think next slide, please. Again, recognizing that the upfront cost of an EV is higher. But when you take into consideration vehicle ownership as a whole, the overall cost of EV ownership is actually lower than the cost of a fossil fuel vehicle ownership. And this is due to several factors, including less expensive fuel. Fueling with electricity is the equivalent of spending roughly $1.50 on a gallon of gas. Less maintenance of your vehicle due to fewer moving parts. And automakers will be required to provide longer warranty periods and produce cars that have longer useful life, increasing the longevity of your vehicle and its components. Next slide, please. A key difference between EVs and gas and diesel vehicles: you can fuel your car at home. The vast majority of EV fueling will take place at home, maximizing savings and convenience. Plus, with the vehicle to home technology, which allows you to use your vehicle's battery as a power source, you may use your electric vehicle to power your home during a power outage. At-home charging should be available for everyone, even if you don't own your own home. Vermont is currently piloting a grant program to install charging stations at apartment buildings and other locations to serve rental housing, and will be deploying a second round of funding for this purpose later this year. And Bronwyn from Department of Housing and Community Development is hopefully joined this meeting and available to answer questions about those grant opportunities. Next slide, please. You don't need to stay close to home to charge your EV. Public charging is available now and in more locations than you may think. This map of EV charging stations from the Drive Electric Vermont website shows more than 300 public chargers are available. Vermont continues to invest in public charging in strategic locations such as workplaces, along highway corridors, in downtowns and villages, and at popular destinations. The National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program will also be providing a significant amount of funding to help states deploy EV charging along highway corridors and other locations. All 50 states have submitted EV charging plans under this program, which will help to ensure when you are traveling outside of Vermont, you'll have a place to charge your vehicle. Next slide, please. Another common concern about EVs is, are they really cleaner than gasoline vehicles? When you consider life cycle emissions. First, let's talk about what we mean by life cycle. Life cycle emissions are emissions estimates that account for emissions associated with the entire life of the vehicle and fuels, from extraction of materials to the manufacturing and operation of the vehicle, and through the disposal of the vehicle and components. So the answer is yes, EVs are cleaner. This is because when you consider the higher impacts of battery production, manufacturing, and electricity generation, the lifetime emissions of the EV are significantly lower. And this is true, especially in Vermont, where less than 10% of electricity purchased is generated using fossil fuels. Another important consideration is what happens to these batteries at the end of their useful life. Automakers will be required to label EV batteries so that they are handled appropriately at the end of their useful life, while EV battery reuse and recycling is still an emerging opportunity. It is likely to become standard as the value of battery materials is high and disposal is not economical. Reuse of these batteries is most likely to be in a stationary application, such as powering a cellular tower. We acknowledge the increasing use of EV technology may induce new demand for various materials. However, there are a few other things to consider in this conversation. First, demand for these resources is already increasing with federal governments, increased support of EVs, and the international efforts to electrify mobile sources to meet commitments made by the European Union and the United Nations. Excuse me. And second, EV technology is improving rapidly, and manufacturers are working to phase out the use of certain minerals such as cobalt. Last, and perhaps most importantly, fossil fuel extraction and transportation, such as through pipelines, has created serious harms to our environment and people's lives. And we look to the future of our transportation system in Vermont. We should consider all of these impacts. Next slide, please. While overall electric loads have been declining in recent years because of improving energy efficiency in many different uses and applications, we project the demand for electricity will increase due to the shift to electric transportation, which is represented by the blue portion on this graph. Fortunately, integrated resources planning done by Vermont's electric utilities shows that the demand can be met and that load management strategies will be critical to managing the increased demand. These strategies include EV charging related initiatives. For example, management strategies such as time of use rates will shift charging to non-peak system hours to mitigate grid impacts during peak times and prevent potential system overloads. Time of use rates have a dual benefit of shifting loads to non-peak hours by charging EVs overnight, and also potentially saving consumers money by offering low-cost electricity during those overnight non-peak low electricity usage periods. There is also work being done to enable the energy stored in electric vehicle batteries to be discharged to a connected building or even to the distribution grid, whether in response to extreme events or as part of regular load shifting. Next slide, please. We anticipate that the benefits of these rules will be felt by all Vermonters. Reductions in harmful air pollution, including carbon emissions, will result in significant cost savings over the lifetime of the regulations proposed. Many of us generally regard air quality in Vermont as good and clean. It's important to note that we've worked very hard as a state to achieve that reality. And this action represents an ability to maintain good air quality. However, local conditions that are harmful do exist, and especially in disadvantaged communities or where frontline workers are most likely to be exposed. In reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we will see avoided economic impacts on agriculture, health, energy use, and other aspects of the economy. In reducing harmful air pollutants like particulate matter, which is caused by the combustion of fossil fuels. We avoid health-related costs from emergency room visits, missed days of work, and incidences of respiratory and cardiovascular disease, especially in disadvantaged and frontline communities. Next slide, please. An important consideration is how will this transition be equitable? First and foremost, by increasing the number of EVs on the road and continuing to clean up conventional internal combustion engine vehicles, the proposed rules will reduce exposure to vehicle pollution in communities throughout Vermont, including frontline communities that are disproportionately exposed to vehicular pollution. The proposal requires automakers to improve warranty and durability of the vehicles and facilitate charging and battery labeling, which will help ensure access for all Vermonters if they want to replace their fossil fuel powered vehicles with new or used EVs that meet their transportation needs. These measures are particularly important for consumers in low income and underserved communities where used vehicle sales are significant. The proposal also encourages automakers to invest in environmental justice efforts, earning more compliance credits when they improve access to electric vehicles in overburdened and low-income communities, when they produce more affordable EVs, and when they invest in clean mobility programs in Vermont. And last, as mentioned earlier in this presentation, there are local, state, and federal incentives to help reduce the upfront costs of these vehicles. Next slide. We recognize that businesses in Vermont will be impacted by this transition too, from vehicle repair service providers to businesses that own large truck fleets. These entities will need support in meeting the barriers of increased EV adoption. Help is available to fleets and equipment owners too. We've already partnered with school districts, public transit agencies, electric utilities, waste haulers, and municipalities to start fleet electrification in Vermont. In addition, the recent Inflation Reduction Act includes medium and heavy duty vehicle purchase tax credits to cover the difference in purchase cost, EV refueling infrastructure tax credits, and workforce development support rebates. Earlier this month, we also hosted a medium and heavy duty vehicle stakeholder meeting for these businesses and fleet owners, and that recording can be found on our website. I hope that this information that we've shared has been helpful in broadening understanding of these rules and their impacts. I'll now turn it back over to David for the discussion, and so we can hear from you with your ideas and reactions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Deirdre. Excellent. Okay, so that's an overview of the context, the rule, what's happening now, and some of these ideas about how is this helpful for Vermont. These are 3 discussion questions we wanted to put out there and kick us off talking about today. And the first one is about what would help you and other Vermonters benefit from this transition that Deirdre laid out and not be burdened by it. Okay, so that's the first question to think about, is like, what makes this a benefit and helps prevent any kind of burden that it would create. Question number 2, you can see there, other reactions that you have to this shift to cleaner vehicles and the rules that are going to support this shift that are being proposed. And then obviously if there's other questions. So just like how Richard's done in the chat, in the Zoom, on the very bottom of your Zoom screen, if you're not as familiar with this platform, is a little tab that's called Reactions. And if you click on Reactions, the very first thing says Raise Hand. And that's where you can do what folks are doing right now to raise your hand to get in the queue and answer these questions or otherwise make a comment. If you'd like to do a question in the chat, that's fine too. What I love to avoid is having some sort of parallel conversation going on in the chat. So let's stick to just questions in the chat. And there's a great question right now in the chat. Will these questions and comments here be, yes, documented as formal public comment? Yes, they will. So today's everything, the reason we're recording is to make sure that all this gets adequately and appropriately documented as part of the public comment around this rule. Okay, so let me just go through hands here, and thanks everyone for helping to keep this conversation constructive and on point. Richard, you go first.
Thank you very much. I'm very encouraged by this and also appreciate the excellent presentation. In answer to the first question, I live on Route 11617 in Bristol, Vermont. And I'm very concerned about the health impacts of the traffic that goes right by my house. We have a great deal of heavy truck traffic, loggers, stone trucks. The traffic has increased dramatically. And so we know that the particulates coat our house. We have to wash it down periodically. And obviously this is in the air we breathe. I'm also a member of Vermont Interfaith Power and Light, and certainly one of our concerns is related to the social justice aspect of reducing the health impacts in marginalized and disadvantaged communities. So I think this bill has, as much as I can see so far, has really, really positive aspects, and I really strongly support it.
Thanks. Thanks, Richard. I really appreciate that comment.
You're welcome.
Let me go next to Marlena. Marlena, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. And Richard makes wonderful points. I think that's very important. Someone had mentioned the multi-unit dwelling funding. There is, I do just want to point out, that's only for buildings with over 10 units. There is some issues with that as far as equity. Our region, I'm from the Northwest region. I don't know that we had many more than 3 or 4 places that qualified for that. We have a lot of people living in multi-unit dwellings that have maybe 4, 5, 6, and finding ways to make sure those people have access is very important. Also, something that I've really noticed is I drive an electric vehicle, and as soon as I started driving it, I would have people stop me and ask questions. People are really curious. The technology changes so quickly that I think there's a lot of outdated ideas about how far they can go, how long they take to charge, how much they cost. And we've held many successful EV rider drive events where people who have EVs come, and then people can tour them, drive them, and ask questions. And those have been so successful in people actually being able to get human answers for their questions. And I think really taking that approach of using current EV drivers and conversations as our way to reach out to people is critical. And I worked through Mileage Smart, and just a kind of acknowledgement that they were really wonderful and super helpful and made the process really easy. So we do have wonderful people working on it in the state. And then I'll just leave it with a question. Sorry, that was a lot. But I know we saw in the Inflation Reduction Act some pretty disappointing cuts in what vehicles get incentives if they're not, their final assembly isn't in the US. Will that be affecting Vermont state credits? Like any of that funding, does that trickle down through the things like Mileage Smart for used or Vermont incentives for new? And can we expect any changes to that?
Thanks, Marlena, for those comments. And what I'll do is let's collect a couple questions, and then I'll turn it back over, whether it's to Deirdre or some of the colleagues from ANR or VTrans, and we'll pick up those questions like the one Marlena just asked about the changes in the federal legislation and the impacts that will have. Vince, you're up next.
Hi, let's see, I'm not showing up here, but in any case, I have a couple of questions. One prefatory question. Is there a representative from the PUC here?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer. So if there is, perhaps someone can wave their hand. But if not, feel free to ask a question, Vince, and we can make sure that that is
Okay, great.
transmitted
So,
to the right person.
Great. I'm just going to, assuming that all the advantages of electrification and the necessity, which, yeah, I think are pretty incontrovertible. The rules, well, they're missing something, but they're also in this meeting, at least in isolation. And I want to know about coordination with, the increased demand, especially with the integration of heat pumps and vehicles, any planning for managed charging, as a storage asset for vehicle integration. I mean, there don't seem to be any rules within this. This just appears to relate to emissions, and it really doesn't talk about any of the other implications. And it's extremely important for planning purposes to make sure that the implications of the demand are integrated into the rules. And also the advantages of, for grid purposes, for storage and frequency regulation, capacity, peak shaving, stuff like that. So I guess what I think this is a great meeting, great public forum, but it's missing a huge component. And I want to know, about coordination with PUC, coordination with all the other entities for whom these rules have implications, having those requirements to have this number of EVs.
Thanks, Vince. That's really helpful. And like I said, let me pull together a couple questions, and then we'll circle those back. And I've been writing those down. I can even share my screen in a second and show you what I'm writing down. Thanks for that question and the comment baked inside that question, Vince.
Sure.
Okay. Matthew, you're up next.
Greetings. This is Matthew. Is there any accessibility components to these draft proposals moving forward? Like, having accessibility, toward, these transportation, because this is not one size fit all. I'm wondering if, if there is accessibility components moving forward that we can address throughout the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you. Great question. Let's do a couple more and then we'll do a pause, and maybe I'll give folks from the agency, from the state, a chance to follow up on some of these questions that have been posed. Wayne, go ahead.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much. I strongly support what you're trying to accomplish with these rules. I wanted to make one comment and then ask one question. I had served formally for 10 years as a member of the Burlington Planning Commission, and we have the Climate Action Plan in Burlington and our comprehensive plan, and they're also in line with probably what most municipalities say about the importance of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and how much the transportation sector is generating these. So I think these steps that you're proposing are really important steps to take. My question is, and there was some discussion in the presentation of buses and trucks. So I'm curious if they're integrated into the same rules, or if there's a separate set of rules that are going to be developed for buses and or for trucks. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Great question. Thanks, Wayne. Let me take one more, and then I'm just going to do a quick pause. Keep your hands up, but let's do one more. I see a hand from Brian, and let me just pause so we don't get too many questions in before I give the agency a time to answer. Brian?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. First of all, I have a couple, maybe comments, concerns, or questions, and I would say that generally I support the concepts, but I do have some concerns. I do appreciate the work that scientists do to understand, climate change and what impacts and causes it. I actually, appreciate that, and I'm not qualified to argue their science. I understand the needs for actions in the developed world, of which Vermont is a small, but well, for us, an important part. I also agree that fossil fuels and other powerful interests have an outsized impact on policy matters like we're discussing today. I also would say that my next vehicle will very likely be an electric vehicle without this. When my Subaru finally rusts out from Vermont's love affair with salt applications on the road. I'm retired. I have a home. I can plug my vehicle in overnight. I am fortunate at this point in my life. I was not always so fortunate. And so when I say these next things, the US, arguably the wealthiest country in the world, but we have an obscene level of poverty relative to our overall wealth. It is the least fortunate among us that feel the bite either way, whether we put initiatives like this in place, Vermont, California, or otherwise, or if we don't do these things, because it's the least fortunate among us that suffer the consequences the most of climate change and degradation in that area. What I'm getting here is that poverty at some point is going to have to be a crisis to be addressed as well. And while I know that's not the forum here, this initiative, it has the potential to impact the poor. And I know we've had some discussions in here on charging stations and how many units a place has to have. But if Vermont were to eliminate its entire carbon footprint tomorrow, the overall impact in the world would be negligible. So we're only 600,000 people. We're generally a rural state. We don't have much power generation because we're small. We don't have much industry. That's why the large percent on the graph that was shown to us on what percent comes from transportation in Vermont, in part is because of the distribution of carbon generation. But we also have to appreciate that being leaders, someone has to set the example. My concern is if we decide to be in the leadership role, that is not the poorest among us, our poorest neighbors, that are paying for our the most for our well-intentioned incentives. Vermont's minimum wage, I believe, is an abysmal $12.33 an hour. That's $26,000 a year before taxes, if I did my public school math correctly.
This guy,
if you can, housing costs in Vermont, and we're now going to have low-wage workers trying to deal with higher automobile costs on top of outrageous rents. I'm not convinced that the rebates and tax credits are going to be enough to help those people. We don't have something like light rail like they do in Portland, Oregon, in Burlington. So I think if we want to set examples and be leaders as a community, I'm calling Vermont a community, I think we have to make sure that those things are carefully considered. So that said, Green Mountain Power, have they considered generation, transmission, and distribution? It looks like from the graph that you showed that has been considered, that if they can handle an increase in electric needs. But if we all charge up every night, there is no solar to support it. So I think for my support on this, Green Mountain Power would have to sign up in such a way that they're not in the off hours just burning gas and importing power from somewhere else. So all we've done is shifted our carbon footprint to another state. California has done this when they got rid of using coal. They just import power from Arizona.
Brian, I'm just going to interrupt for a second, say if we can wrap up, and I want to make sure we have time for others too.
Yep, absolutely. I'll try to be quick. I think my point is, I'm not the decider here. I'm just a resident and a citizen in Vermont. But if I was to support it, I would want to make sure that at the very least, when you draw that graph of what percent are going to be electric vehicles, that there is an assessment that runs along with charging capability for everyone. If that graph of charging capability falls short, then the adjustment date for 2035 for 100% has to be reduced, because we cannot just force electric vehicles into a system in a society that is not in a position to support it. So that's where I would leave it. That's
great. Thanks, Brian, for those points. And those are a couple different points. I'm just going to share my screen. Megan, if you want to stop sharing yours for 1 second. And let me share my screen for just a moment here, because hang on a second. This is me just taking some quick notes, right? Quick notes about some of the points you all are making. This is not the sort of official public comment moment. This is me just trying to capture what's being said and capture some of these questions as well. Questions around, will the changes that were happening on incentives, the Inflation Reduction Act, affect what's going on in Vermont and affect this rule and all that? Coordination with around the increased demand around heat pumps and other parts of electrification that we'll likely see. And a comment that's extremely important to think about that implications and pull that into the rule. A question about the accessibility components of transportation for these changes going forward, and how we should be thinking about the accessibility piece. A specific question about buses and trucks being integrated into the rule or a separate rule. And then a concern about who can afford to buy electric vehicles and repairs. Can anyone hack vehicles? I just cut and paste that from the chat. And some of the pieces about the comments up here are a little bit like a question baked in as well, but it's like, how are we ensuring that when this transition happens, the poorest among us are not the ones bearing that cost? So those are some of the things I heard people say, and I'll just take a quick pause from the questions to go back to some of the folks from the state government that are with us today, whether from VTrans or from ANR, Deirdre or her colleagues, and say, would you be able to address some of these questions just briefly, and then I'll get back into the other hands. I'll stop sharing for a moment, but please let me know if it's helpful to put those questions back up.
Oh, David, this is Megan. You can leave them up, I think, if you'd like. That's helpful for us.
Great.
If that's okay.
Yeah.
So this is Megan O'Toole. I'm the Climate Change Mitigation Coordinator at the Agency of Natural Resources, and have been working with Deirdre and others on these roles. And so I'll try to tackle some of these questions, and then also defer to some colleagues that are also joining us today. In terms of the changes that have been made to the federal tax credit incentive for EV purchase in the Inflation Reduction Act, answer to that is no, that those requirements that have been incorporated into that tax credit eligibility requirement via the Inflation Reduction Act will not affect the state law that we have put in place regarding the level of incentives that we are offering as a state. And it should also not impact the other incentives that Deirdre had walked through in the slide, talking about how we're trying to address the upfront costs of electric vehicle ownership in the state of Vermont specifically. Obviously, we design our incentive programs in ways that they can coordinate or be stacked upon one another. And so not having a wider availability of that federal tax credit will certainly impact, I think, people's choices in terms of purchasing an EV. So we are concerned about that. And I'd like to invite Dave Roberts from Drive Electric Vermont to add anything there that I may have missed.
Hi, folks. Dave Roberts, Drive Electric Vermont. Thanks, Megan. I think you covered it. I did put links in the chat earlier to some of the resources on the Drive Electric Vermont website, which includes a whole page that goes through some of the changes on the federal tax credit related to the Inflation Reduction Act, which did eliminate tax credits effective on passage for vehicles manufactured outside North America. So that's unfortunate, but hopefully in the long term, the benefits of that will outweigh that short-term issue, because the Inflation Reduction Act did extend the availability of the tax credit through 2032. So it's a 10-year time frame, and we are hearing that automakers are beginning to shift production to North America to meet those the IRA requirements. So
Thanks, Dave.
Yep.
That's great. Megan, some of these other ones, go ahead, please.
Yeah. So in terms of the increased demand on the electric grid, I think the question asker is correct that we don't have anyone from the Public Utility Commission on the line that I could see, but we are joined by our colleague Philip Picott from the Public Service Department, and I'd like to invite Philip to answer this question if he's still with us.
Philip, if you're there, you're on mute. Oh, I'm not seeing you in the participant list right now.
Okay. Okay, well, I think just, generally I can speak to the fact that, I think the question also, with the question there was also the concern that, these rules don't specifically address some of these issues related to, I think specifically the impacts that increased electrification on our transportation fleet is going to have. And how we, manage charging and increase demand from other ways in which we're electrifying, our thermal needs as well. But, a lot of these questions and considerations have been discussed and addressed in the Public Service Department's most recent comprehensive energy plan, which was released earlier this year. And we can put a link to that in the chat for folks to refer to. But what I understand from our colleagues at the Public Service Department is that the resource planning that we've seen from the distribution utility so far does indicate that there is enough electricity to handle the increased demand that we foresee, at least in the short term, but that there's going to be a number of strategies that will be important to implement to manage the increased demand in the future as electrification on many fronts ramps up, including managed charging, as Deirdre has mentioned in the presentation. So we will drop that in the chat for folks and encourage there to be further conversations about this issue. In terms of the accessibility question, I guess I would like, if the question asker is still available, I'd like to know a little bit more about what you mean in terms of accessibility, because I think we could interpret that as applying in different ways to this program. So I just want to make sure, I'm wondering if they're still with us, if could just get a little more clarity on that.
Yeah, Matthew, if you're still on the call and you want to provide a little more detail,
Yes,
great.
this is Matthew. Can you hear me? You repeat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just let you know. Yes, with the accessibility meaning manufacturers, car making, automakers, the accessibility components, of this, moving forward, because not all cars are created equal. Not all diesels are created equal. Not all trucks are created equal for the individual that's purchasing these vehicles moving forward. So that's on a more broader term of, the accessibility component that I'm looking forward to, because not everybody can get into a truck, that's knee high or taller, and they need a truck or vehicle that's specifically built for them.
Thanks, Matthew.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I think that's, certainly a concern as, as we shift to electrification in our transportation fleet. I think there's a lot of questions about, what that change in power the vehicle will mean for, how much the vehicle will weigh and how it will otherwise be technically configured and physically configured differently from what what we see in traditional internal combustion engine vehicles. So I think that's a great question. Unfortunately, and maybe others from our Agency of Transportation could weigh in here, but it's my understanding that Vermont doesn't have the ability to set specific accessibility standards for vehicles in that way. I believe that the federal government has sole jurisdiction or the sole ability to kind of dictate to auto manufacturers how vehicles address the concern that you raised. So, unfortunately, I don't think we are able to address that in this specific rulemaking or via other actions that the state could take on its own.
Thanks, Megan. The other ones?
In terms of trucks and buses, yes, absolutely. This is actually a new component of our rule, as Deirdre mentioned. So we will be including not only the zero emission vehicle sales component for trucks and buses, but we'll also be requiring that the trucks and buses that are delivered for sale and sold in Vermont be cleaner emitting for those that are still the fossil fuel powered. And from a criteria pollutant or traditional air pollutant perspective, and then also from a greenhouse gas perspective. So yes, we're really feel like this is an important evolution in our current program to include these types of vehicles. And then in terms of the question about affordability, obviously that is a really big concern, and Deirdre mentioned that we're concerned about, the difference in upfront costs and how to address that in the short term until the market for EVs becomes more cost comparable to traditional vehicles. And then the repair question is a really great one. And we really appreciate this comment because we've received some similar feedback regarding incorporating what is referred to as right to repair as a component of these regulations, and making sure that the ability to repair and maintain these vehicles isn't kind of owned solely by the auto manufacturers, but that other people can, conduct necessary repairs that don't have that, proprietary ability, and so that you have a little bit or more flexibility and choice in how you repair your vehicle. So that's an important comment for us. And I think, we are considering incorporating that right to repair piece into our rule based on the feedback similar to this that we've received so far. So thank you. And I think there was another question in the chat about related to open protocol standards for electric vehicle charging stations, or what we call interoperability. And while again our rules don't directly address that requirement, I will say that that is a component of state policy that we have implemented whenever we are providing public funds to build out our charging network in the state of Vermont. We consider interoperability to be a really important component of stations that get installed with public funds. So while we haven't implemented that via a legal standard, we've implemented it as a policy when we're spending, public funds to build out our charging network. So that's a great question, and we appreciate the comment. And I think that was all the questions we've heard so far, but David or others, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think that's a great start. And I think if folks want to provide more pointing questions for the agency, now's a great time to do it. I'll keep taking some notes like this as we go, and we'll do another circle back to get a round of potential, answers or whatever the agency can say. Okay, so let's get back to some of the hands, and thanks everyone for being patient with that. Olivia, you've been patient. You're up next. Olivia Campbell?
Yeah, sorry, just give me a second to unmute and take my hands down too. Thanks for organizing this session. And particularly I appreciate having a virtual session, because for those of us who couldn't get to the meetings in person, it makes it easier to participate. So my name is Olivia Campbell Anderson, and I want to talk a little bit about my perspective as a farm owner and a new farmer, actually having a business in a rural community, and the impact that this is going to have, as well as some ideas to answer your question about how to, I don't really see it as a burden, but how to make it more workable and accessible for small businesses. So again, my name's Olivia, and I founded and own with my husband Anderbelt Acres. We're an organic and regenerative farm in East Montpelier. We have 35 acres. We grow flowers, berries, pumpkins, and other crops. So a little bit, I appreciate also the state's leadership in recognition of the impacts, because we've seen quite a bit of that on our farm, where we, we had 1 year where we lost strawberries, and this year was really hard on our gourd pumpkin crops, just because we keep flipping from essentially soil flooding, not literal flooding, but our soil flooding from too much heavy, fast rains, and then drought conditions. So we're kind of really already experiencing climate change on our farm here and are having to learn new ways to address that in dealing with these extreme climate flips back and forth. We just never know what's going to happen, and it seems worse than usual or historically. So we specifically, as related to medium and heavy duty vehicles, we rely on deliveries of, because we're a small business, so we can't make enough compost or wood chips on our land for what we need. So we rely on other local businesses for deliveries of compost, wood chips, stone, and other supplies that come in, heavy duty trucks. We also, being in a rural community, we have a lot of those logging and, compost and fuel delivery trucks that drive by our house every day, and our farm every day, as well as garbage vehicles that would all be impacted by this proposed rule, hopefully in a positive way. So I also want to mention the health impacts for those Vermonters, like my family, but also those workers who are delivering this supplies to us in the sector, that are exposed to pollution in that work that impacts their health and then also impacts our healthcare costs and our quality of life. So the other thing that I think hasn't been raised yet is really the benefits to our rural community and our rural economy here in Vermont. Given it, compared to the scope of the country, we know Vermont's a brave little state, but we're a small market and a rural state. And so I'm really concerned about our communities, if this rule doesn't pass, being left behind and not having access to these new technologies and these vehicles, because there's actually extremely high demand for electric vehicles, both in the light duty, but also in heavy duty. Like, for example, we would like to get an electric delivery van for our farm, but we can't access it because it's not available to us. Those vans are going to the bigger markets and bigger companies like Amazon and FedEx and California and New York. Vermont overall is a really small market, so we don't have access immediately to the products. We're sort of, lower tier in terms of a customer, just because we don't have that much large of a market quantity of purchasing power. And particularly for us as a small family farm business, I can't, we're not at a place, and we may never be, where we need to buy dozens of vehicles. I just need one or two, especially for, electric tractor and delivery trucks and things like that. So the small businesses, one of the things I like about this is that it kind of, creates equity between those big businesses and those big markets and the small businesses in the rural markets, because it makes sure that the manufacturers don't ignore us, that they have to provide some vehicles to us, and kind of changes that power dynamic. I'm a small business, I'm not Amazon. So I don't have, when I'm competing against those businesses for equipment and things like that, I don't have any power against multinational vehicle manufacturers.
Olivia, I'm just going to interrupt you just real quick. Olivia, I'm just going to interrupt to say, if you can wrap it up, that'd be fantastic, just because I know we got a lot of people in the queue. These are really interesting points. I don't want to interrupt your sentence right now, but if there's some last things you want to say, it'd be great if you want to wrap it up.
Sure. So it would be actually helpful in future meetings if you could tell people in advance if there's time limits and in your structure, so that we can be prepared. Because I was thinking it would be more like, 4 or 5 minutes for testimony, or for sharing and having dialogue. So the other thing I want to mention is specifically answering your question about how to health. businesses like mine and farms specifically with implementation of this proposal. And so there's quite a few, I have a list of things to share on that. So we need a statewide EV minimum requirement and make ready programs for electric utilities. You know, my farm is serviced by Washington Electric Co-op, and I have to, the person that's at the end of the line, or, you know, I don't have the same access to the same benefits that Green Mountain Power provides their customers. I don't have access to make ready. So as a small farm, I have to pay for the transformers. I have to pay for the grid upgrades. So as we are working to cut pollution and electrify, I have to pay for all of that. But somebody in Green Mountain Power territory doesn't. Someone in Burlington Electric territory doesn't. So I'm burdened being in a rural community. There's a disadvantage of the rural communities based on who my electric supplier is. So having make ready grid programs statewide would be a huge benefit for those of us that are small businesses and folks with fleets. I also, a lot of the incentives are designed for large businesses and old or historic businesses with a lot of experience. Our farm's 3 years old, so we don't have, you know, when you think about what do new businesses and growing businesses and smart businesses need for the incentives. Most of the incentives for replacing vehicles, you have to like scrap an old vehicle, or you have to prove that you can, you've had the vehicle for so many years. Well, like, so we don't have access to vehicles because we're only a 3-year-old business. So think about like specific incentives for new businesses and agricultural businesses and small businesses, because I think a lot of the incentives aren't designed for this. We can't access and benefit from them.
Olivia, I'm gonna, sorry, just one more time. I was,
things.
if you've got a list, I'd love it if you maybe you throw it in the chat, or you can submit it in the official email so it gets into the record. And I'm just feeling nervous about a lot of other folks who are trying to jump in as well. So I'll just, you know, if you have one more second to wrap up, that'd be great. But I fear we need to switch gears.
And then next time I would recommend that you have more oriented facilitation and give speakers specific amounts of time, because
Sure.
I think I've used probably 3 to 4 minutes.
Sure.
So, and also you guys scheduled the in-person meeting as the same day as the Farm Bureau meeting that only meets once a year. So those of us in Washington County couldn't come in person.
Oh, that's a shame. That's too bad.
So
Yeah.
about when scheduling meetings with other conflicts. Thank you.
Thanks, Olivia. I really appreciate that input. And I encourage you, if you have more written input, to submit that, and that'll be very helpful.
Yeah, David, I was just going to say that if folks do have to drop off or don't have an opportunity to, you know, get all their comments out verbally here, of course, we're accepting written comments to incorporate into our record until September 30th. So please feel free to submit those.
Great, great. Super. And if folks are looking for a little guidance, yeah, I think in the 2-minute mark is what we're looking for, just to make sure everybody has a chance. And then folks, we're happy to stay on a little bit later too after the meeting if we have some time when folks are out of questions. Tom Miller, I see you're up with your hand next.
Yeah, hello. Quick question. Can you explain the process to adopt ACC2 and the timing for that? Do you think that will be completed by the end of 2022?
Great. Sure. That's a quick question. I'll write that down on my list. Thanks, Tom. Rob Kidd, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you all for these hearing sessions you're all doing. I've heard a couple questions asked over the time frame where you all stated that the California Air Resources Board does a periodic review of the rules to make sure that they're being complied with or following through, they're successful. How much more can the state of Vermont do to review this? Or are we going to be relying on could we do that, like kind of get an agency review to make sure these vehicles are coming? to Vermont, because I feel like some people are worried about this is not being able to access vehicles, but I'm understanding that we can adjust the program down the road in say 6 years, say we're not getting the measures we need. And then also, I just wanted to relate it towards that about some of the fleet rules, like if we can get some reporting mechanisms. I know California has like a high burden for fleets, but if in Vermont we can do a lower like threshold, like 5, those who have 5 vehicles or more in their fleet have to report or something, so we can keep track of that data. And that's it. But thank you all for your time in informing people.
Thanks, Rob. Great. Appreciate the questions and comments. Jordan, go ahead, please.
Thanks, David. And I will, I'll try to be brief, and I'll be following up with some more details in my written comments. But Jordan Giacconi with Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility, mostly just offering public comment really to share organization's strong support for both rules. Amongst sort of our 650 so member businesses across the state, I think we all recognize that we have both, an environmental obligation to tackle our transportation emissions, but an economic one as well. As others may have alluded to in the presentation, and also, big credit to EAN for gathering this data. But, Vermonters spent more than $700 million on fossil fuels for transportation in 2020 alone. About 72% of that left the state's economy. Compare that to electricity, about 70% stays here in the state. So I think it's important to recognize that as we move toward EV adoption, we have more larger economies of scale and can then reallocate funding for the purposes of EV incentives, charger incentives, things to help people overcome those cost barriers. And recognizing that there's disproportionate energy burdens placed on those shoulders of rural and low income Vermonters. But compare that to a switch over to an EV, they can save up to $1,500 per year in operational maintenance costs alone. So the return on investment is certainly there. It would most assuredly bolster household buying power, keep more dollars in our economy. And then also would encourage folks to consider the price volatility of fossil fuels to compare to electricity. And it becomes really clear, I think, switching to EVs is a no-brainer from an economic side for business owners and customers alike. And also, one other piece I did want to address is folks mentioned sort of concerns around low-income family, how this will impact low-income Vermonters. Coming from a low-income family myself, being a first-generation college student, I can safely say that when we were looking to buy new cars, not once did we ever look to buy new. So what I would say is that as the number and variety of EVs increases, as we implement these rules going forward, prices come down. We'll also see an influx of EVs heading into the used market. And those incentives offered by federal and state governments, by utilities, can help bring those prices down even more. So I think there's definitely a strong proponent of additional state and federal investment in fleet electrification to overcome some of these upfront cost barriers. But I think recognizing that the more that we shift the state toward this, the more we can help deal with these affordability issues. And then just, I think sort of in conclusion, recognizing as well an appreciation for the suite of incentives presently available for EV charging infrastructure. So I think, again, as we move toward adopting these rules, keep more dollars flowing into our economies, can leverage additional state, federal revenues to help to overcome some of these upfront cost barriers. So thanks again for the opportunity to comment. I'll follow up with more detailed comments in my written report out. But yeah, thanks all. Appreciate the time.
Thanks, Jordan. Really appreciate it. I've got a hand up from, says owner Charlotte Kennedy. So I'll just open the floor to you, whoever's behind that screen name of owner Charlotte Kennedy. And you might not know that that's your Zoom screen name. Okay. So feel free to jump in later if someone is named Charlotte Kennedy or has a screen name that's owner Charlotte Kennedy. Feel free to open up your mic at anytime. Let me go on then to Jordan Bryn.
Yeah, hi. Jordan Bryn here on behalf of the Natural Resources Defense Council in support of the rules that will allow Vermont to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. I'll keep my comments just to a couple minutes today to respect everyone's time. But first, I just wanted to thank the Agency of Natural Resources for your work and for hearing everyone out and answering everyone's questions and for the opportunity for everyone to comment today. So I just want to note that the transportation sector in Vermont accounts for nearly 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the state. It's also a major contributor of health harming pollutants. So reducing vehicle emissions is absolutely vital to protecting public health, addressing the climate crisis, and also boosting Vermont's growing clean energy economy. So the Advanced Clean Trucks and the Low NOx Heavy Duty Omnibus and the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rules were all informed by years of extensive feedback and analysis that proved with overwhelming evidence their cost effectiveness and feasibility. So I just wanted to make 3 quick points today on this feasibility because a lot of these questions tend to come up and concerns tend to be voiced around these. So first, the technology for clean cars and clean trucks is available today. Automakers have already announced over $97 billion in investments for zero emissions vehicles. There are over 145 models of zero emissions trucks available today. That includes 24 of the heavy duty models. And here I'll also note that 70% of the trucks, or nearly 70% of the trucks registered in Vermont are Class 2B to Class 3 vehicles. So those are the ones that are most readily available and also make the most cost-effective sense to electrify today. And then the second point I wanted to make is that these rules will help drivers and fleets save money. So an EV owner saves 60% by paying for electricity rather than gasoline for their car. And they also save nearly 40% on maintenance costs on a per mile basis compared to a gasoline powered vehicle owner. And also many electric trucks and buses are already competitive on a total cost of ownership basis today, thanks to these fuel and maintenance cost savings. So the payback period to make up for that initial higher purchase price is about 3 to 5 years, which is much longer than, or much shorter time period than the electric truck's lifespan. So it does make a lot of business sense. And then also opposing piston engines that meet the NOx standards can actually save 11% on costs compared to the more polluting engines. And then the final point I make is that drivers and fleets want electric vehicles. Surveys show that 40% of Vermont residents would like to purchase an EV. And many fleets across the nation are increasingly demanding clean trucks and vans to capitalize on these cost savings. So there are over 140,000 pending orders for zero emissions trucks. This includes large retailers that operate in Vermont, like Nestle and Walmart and Ben & Jerry's. These companies are also in support of the ACT rule. And then one last note I'll make, because I've heard a lot of concerns about it today, is that these rules send a clear market signal that will kind of reduce some of this uncertainty around charging infrastructure investment and grid investment. Just so as an example, New Jersey adopted the Advanced Clean Trucks rule a couple years ago, and they were able to justify, their Board of Public Utilities was able to justify plans to invest a lot more in charging infrastructure for these new vehicles. So just to conclude today, the Advanced Clean Trucks rule, the Low NOx Heavy Duty Omnibus rule, and the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rules are expected to accrue billions of dollars in public health savings, and also on fuel maintenance costs for drivers and fleet owners, and they should be adopted as soon as possible in Vermont. Thank you guys for your time today.
Thank you, Jordan. Appreciate it. Charlotte Kennedy, I think you're there. If you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to go.
I've unmuted myself. There are two comments I wanted to make. My husband and I are in favor of the proposed rules. We do share the concerns of others that they be done in a way that the needs of low-income people can be met. We drive a Toyota Prius that has averaged over the 4 years we've owned it 50 plus miles to the gallon. We're in our mid 80s. It's hard for us to determine if there is real value, since we don't drive a lot of miles, in taking that car off the road and going to a totally EV car. And I don't know if anybody is looking at that issue. When does it make sense and when does it not make sense? So that's one thing, and I'd be happy just to have comments on that. And the other thing is, we live in the Champlain Islands. Like the rest of Vermont, we're a tourist economy. However, the tourist economy here, as you know, there's one route through the Champlain Islands. It's Route 2. And every year, every weekend, The traffic that goes through here increases a great deal. And so we need to maintain the tourist industry, but we also need to find ways to cut down on the horrible pollution that's caused by excessive gas-powered traffic, including trucks getting from Route 89 over to New York by the use of the ferry. And those trucks sit and idle both in the lines of traffic and in waiting to get onto the ferry. So those issues need to be addressed in many, many areas of the state, but here it's because of the limited amount of access, it's particularly intense. And I'll stop talking. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for those comments. And the first comment echoes something that was in the chat as well about sort of when to make this shift. Okay, great. Annette Smith, I think you're up next.
Thank you. I'm Annette Smith. I'm Executive Director of Vermonters for a Clean Environment. I am commenting today not in support of this rule adoption at this time. This seems to be aspirational, but I don't think that the technology is ready. I'm especially concerned about the current battery technology and the and other aspects of these vehicles that require a massive increase in mining. And this is sort of mirrors one of the comments just posted by Catherine Rood, that we cannot support this massive increase in resource extraction. And every day I receive more information about new and different batteries that are being developed that have great promise. I live off grid with solar, and I'm still using lead acid batteries. And I don't have an electric vehicle because if I had one, I would be running my gasoline generator to charge it much of the time. I am optimistic there will be breakthroughs in technology, that in the battery technology, that will not require so much resource extraction and will enable much longer lives of the battery and less issues with range anxiety. But I do not support adopting a rule that puts in place something that is so not yet ready. Now, the other issue that I want to raise that I'm not sure has been part of the conversation, but I live in VTEL, Vermont Tel's service territory. We have some of the highest fiber optic telephone service in the state. It was installed in 2014, but it has raised an issue which has created a lot of uproar, which is that when the power goes out, then people lose their telephone service after 6 to 8 hours. It is not uncommon for rural areas of Vermont to lose power for 3 to 5 days. And I'm just realizing what will happen when the power goes out and, okay, you lose your telephone service, but now you can't even drive your car. Now, I understand that there may be the idea that your battery's charged in your car and you can actually run your house off your car. But if your battery isn't, the public safety issues that have been raised just around the telephone battery have been really intense. And so I just want to flag that as something that, what do we do in power outages when people do not have a car and they need to get somewhere? And we are putting all our eggs in these baskets. So thank you very much for the opportunity to comment.
Thanks, Annette. Thanks for the comments. Next up, I see Tom.
Thanks, David. Hey, good afternoon. Tom Benica, I'm Senior Policy Advisor at Rivian Automotive. Rivian manufactures the R1T all-electric pickup, the R1S SUV, and the commercial delivery van for Amazon. Thanks to you all for putting this together. Really appreciate these opportunities for dialogue and discussion. And let me just start by saying quickly that Rivian strongly supports the rulemaking package that's under consideration here, and believes that it really meets the moment. So thanks to the agency for proposing it. We'll follow up with more written comments in that respect. So I'll just use this time for a quick question. Noticed in the rulemaking documents that the agency is proposing to allow manufacturers to begin earning credits under the ACT regulation with model year 24 vehicles. Wondering if the agency can comment on whether a model year 23 start for credit earning was considered, and if there's any sort of discussion around that you can share with us at this point.
Thanks, Tom. So as before, I've been taking some notes of these questions, and just because I see two hands more, let's grab these two hands, or may even be one hand, because I think Vince is already gone, from Representative Burke, and then I'll turn it back over to the agency to answer some of these questions. Representative Burke, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to say that I strongly support these rules. I've been on the Transportation Committee in the House for 14 years. For a bunch of those years, we were not able to think about doing anything about transportation emissions. And in the past few years, we've been able to set up some really, really good incentive programs for electric vehicles. I want to just comment that our electric vehicle incentives do not depend on scrapping a vehicle. There's one program that does that can get stacked on top of other incentives. So I just want to make that clear. And then in response to the concerns about low-income people, we have a really great program that was set up by Sue Minter, former gubernatorial candidate at Capstone Agency, that provides incentives for low-income people to buy used fuel-efficient vehicles. And that's been, and there's also a financial counseling component that goes along with that the Senate, I believe, put into some legislation. So there, we are trying to address the low income, the needs of people. I think that, I would love to put more higher incentives on the new vehicle program, but that's something we'll be discussing. And the other thing in response to the public transit issue, there is a pilot program going on in Montpelier that some of you may know about, sort of like an Uber kind of a program where you just call the bus and it comes and it gives more, you can call the bus from your home and get delivered back to your home. So that sort of is something that's offering a lot of promise in the state to do in other communities. And the Agency of Transportation has these mobility and transportation innovation grants that provide feasibility studies to communities to look at issues of public transit. So I just wanted to flag all that and also just confirm again my real appreciation to all the state agencies that have been working on this issue, and to state my strong support for adopting these rules. Thank you.
Thanks, Representative Burke. Yeah. So Vince, before I go to you, I want to circle back to the agency for a second. And I saw you also just dropped a question in the chat as well. And, I've been trying to keep up. There's been a lot in the chat too. If I just stick with questions for a moment, more than the top piece, these are the questions that we went through before. And here's some new ones, some coming out of the chat, some written. There's more comments above, right? And so there could be some response or something to the comments that maybe the folks from ANR or VTrans or elsewhere would want to answer. But let's start with the things that are straight up questions. And so these are three that came out of the chat, and then some quick ones around the process and the adoption of the rule, and reviewing this process going forward. And then a specific question about the model year 2023, which felt technical and above my pay grade. But Megan or others, if you want to take it away to answer some of these or take a whack at answering some of these questions.
Yeah, so I'll start with the first kind of new one in your list, David. So this type of question about, when does it make the most sense to, replace your existing vehicle with either a more efficient or an electric option is a really great question. Obviously, it's, the answer would entirely depend on each specific scenario, but it is definitely something that we think about. And I know it's something that others, within the state and our partners think about in terms of how we implement our incentive programs and, the types of folks that we are trying to incentivize to make the switch to a cleaner mode of transportation. So I just want to say that, I appreciate the question and the comment, but I, don't have a specific answer today, but just to know that this is definitely a question that we also have on our minds and that we're working through. So sorry, I'm just gonna go down to the next one. So I think, again, use of private vehicles over mass transit. This is another answer that's really specific to a particular scenario. And I don't think that, one that we can get into a lot of detail about today, but just again, thank you for the question and acknowledge that that is a really good question. And just want to acknowledge that, we work with partners at VTrans related to, making policy decisions and thinking about public transit in the state and also electrifying public transit, and that is part of our holistic strategy regarding this transition to a different, what transportation looks like in Vermont and how it's going to look different in the future, either via electrification or via more car sharing, more access to public transit, more innovative public transit program like the one that Representative Burke mentioned. So these are all things that we are thinking about and working to implement currently. And then in terms of, vehicle pollution on heavily traveled roadways, this is obviously, why we are proposing this rule today. We want to reduce emissions from not just smaller vehicles, but truck traffic as well, understanding that there is a really good share of Vermonters that are disproportionately impacted by air pollution caused by those road corridors where we see the heavier truck traffic or, a lot of seasonal traffic related to tourism and, other crowded areas. So again, appreciate that comment and acknowledge that, that is a problem we're trying to solve by this rule. In terms of, our power source in Vermont and how we will be electrifying transportation, how that might reflect, the mix of generation that we currently have access to in Vermont. I'm going to again see if Philip is on the line from the Public Service Department to maybe talk a little bit about how we control emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector in Vermont and our renewable energy standards. So Philip, just checking to see if you're on the line.
Yes. Hi, Megan. Hi, this is Philip Peacock, Department of Public Service. So I only got part of the question, which is, I guess I should just start with Vermont has since 2017 a renewable energy standard. And every 3 years, the amount increases. I think we're at around 70% right now. Each utility's overall energy purchases must be from renewable sources. In addition, they purchase a portion, most utilities purchase a portion of nuclear power, which is lower carbon emitting. And so overall, our grid is relatively low in terms of carbon emissions compared to other states.
Great, thanks. And I think the question would be how to ensure as increased demand happens in Vermont and elsewhere from electric vehicles and from other electrification of home heating, that renewable standard and continues to work, I think is the question.
Thanks, David. So the requirement that's currently in law is it's a proportion of all electricity sales. So as electricity sales grow, that same proportion, and again, it increases over time out to 2032. The proportion would have to maintain or increase the renewable sales as a share of the whole pie. There's also a process that the Public Service Department is kicking off this fall, which will look at what should the renewable energy standard look like. So we are reevaluating it and do that frequently. So I think there's some basic information on our website now that sort of lays out that process. But again, the current statute, the current law requires increasing purchases of renewables through 2032.
Great. Thanks, Philip.
And Philip, if you're able to drop that link in the chat related to that effort that you just mentioned, that would be really helpful. If you have it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great idea. Thanks, Megan.
The next question regarding the process of the rule adoption. We plan to adopt all 4 of the rules that are being proposed today in accordance with the Agency of Natural Resources statutory obligation under the Global Warming Solutions Act, which is that rules that are incorporated into the Climate Action Plan need to be adopted by December 1st of this year. So that is the timeline we are on. I, of course, also want to acknowledge that our target implementation model year for these rules is model year 2026, which means that we need to have the rule adopted at the very latest for that reason by the end of this calendar year. So that is indeed our goal. Okay, so this is Rob's question about the midterm review. So Rob, you're correct that California does conduct a midterm review of their regulatory programs regarding, regulating emissions from cars. And usually that's a process that Vermont participates in, that when it's being led and going through kind of the dialogue about the review. So we don't leave that independent of that process. But I think you're maybe suggesting that Vermont could do this. And we certainly could do this. But I think the outcome of any review that we did, if the outcome of that review is inconsistent with California, because of the rigidity of our situation in relation to adopting these rules and needing to be consistent with California because of the Clean Air Act requirements, we would, at that point, the decision would be either to stay in the program or leave the program. So it would really be a binary choice for us, whereas when we participate in the process with California, it's I think a much more productive conversation that's talking about specific changes to the rule or the program that reflect current realities that we're considering that we didn't have the ability to consider initially. So I hope that makes sense, but I think there's limited utility of Vermont doing its own specific review outside of the California process, if that makes sense. Just Tom's question about model year 2023, and Tom, I know you emailed me about this earlier this week, and my apologies, I haven't been able to respond to you yet. We are thinking about the ability to accept early compliance as early as 2023, and we will consider that consider that a comment when we do our record review before we propose the final rule. But that is a good question and noted, and we will be making a decision about that in the final proposed rule. So thank you. And then hydrogen powered vehicles are considered zero emission vehicles under the definition that we would be adopting in the rule of zero emission vehicles. So the answer to the question is yes, these are all hydrogen technology would be considered a zero emission technology that auto manufacturers could gain credit for towards compliance with this rule.
Great. Okay, super. So those are a bunch of questions. There are also, or there's a whole bunch of comments that were more sort of comment, not so much questions. And folks were putting things in the chat, and I copied some of that in. Olivia put in the chat some of those ways that she's come up with to help small businesses. There was concerns about, is the technology really ready here? Concerns about what happens if we are so dependent on electricity, and is the grid gonna, all of a sudden we're very, very dependent on a grid that potentially could fail us. There were comments about how to support the cost effectiveness and feasibility of this transition for vehicles, some strong support, and the importance of setting these clear rules for doing the build out of the infrastructure for charging. And some pleas as well to don't leave rural communities behind, make sure rural communities and others have access. And there was some stuff in the chat. I just wrote this down from the chat, need to include requirements for vehicle manufacturers to make sure EVs are V2H and V2G ready. for those who are more technically minded. So those are some of the comments that came in that we hadn't covered previously. So I'll just say for the agency folks, if there's other things you would like to react to from what you've heard, those comments I just showed on the screen or other things you've just been listening to, any reactions you'd like to offer up.
Thanks, David. I don't have anything that, you know, that I would like to react to at this time. I guess just to say that we really appreciate the comments, but also just want to acknowledge that we have colleagues on the line from Agency of Transportation, Philip from Public Service, Bronwyn from the Agency of Commerce and Community Development that manages our electric vehicle charging program, including the multi-unit dwelling program. So just a bunch of folks on that may want to chime in where we've you know, haven't covered anything. So just want to give some space for those folks to answer any questions or react to comments.
Thanks. Folks from other agencies, VTrans, others who would like to weigh in here, and any reactions that you'd like to offer having listened in? Okay. Great. Okay. Super. So we have just a moment more. If there's something you're burning that's you really want to say, we actually have a few minutes here at the top of the hour to lay a few more things out. And let's just try to keep it brief. Matthew, go ahead, please.
Moving forward, you know, that interconnected piece, you know, with Vermont's, you know, transportation sector, with the environmental justice and social justice intertwined. How can we all, my main question is with the accessibility component, but how can we all, you know, move together in one way that, you know, in a way where it involves environmental justice and social justice intertwined with a little bit of acceptance and accessibility, but also within that, you know, landscape culture, with the question I'm trying to give to you is, you know, where do we go from here, literally? And just to let you know, I'm on 10 subcommittees around the state of Vermont. So I'm definitely deeply involved with what this commission is, you know, is doing. So, but thank you, just to let you know.
Thanks, Matthew. That's helpful. And this sort of vision of how do all these things fit together, right? And we've heard that a couple comments around that today as well, right? How does all this fit together from a social justice, environmental justice standpoint, from a grid perspective, from a demand perspective? Great. Keeping a holistic view. Great. Anything else from folks? Okay. Great. Well, I want to really appreciate everyone who's weighed in today. What a great conversation, very interesting, back and forth, and a great number of folks who were able to make some comments. Yeah, and Annette's putting in the how to pull it all together from a resource extraction point too. Yeah, Megan, maybe I'll turn it over to you just for some final words, and then we'll finish up.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I just want to echo, you know, David's sentiments. Really appreciate all the good questions and discussion today, and just want to reiterate that all of the comments that were made today, in whatever form they were made, will be incorporated into our formal rulemaking record, and we will be addressing those comments. Is the next part of our rulemaking process will be to take all of the public comments that we've received during these meetings and hearings and respond to them prior to the next phase in our rulemaking, which will be to file with the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. So there's information up on this slide here to either email comments to us. You can get more information about the rulemaking at the two sites, and we will be updating those websites with new information as we go through the process. So feel free to check back. And yeah, I just really appreciate this great feedback, and appreciate everyone taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Hopefully, nice weekend. Take care. All the
Thank
best.
you. Bye.
So-